Hey everybody, Eric of Hit Subscribe. It's been a while since I did one of these. If you were kind of following our movements at all, anyway, the last time I did one, we were in Haley, Idaho. Pardon me, I'm a little thirsty here. Anyway, the topic of today is how do you market to software developers? So I read a blog post recently about developer marketing for the Hit Subscribe blog, and the theme there was if you're non-technical and you're looking to do something, market a product or something to software developers, how do you go about doing that? And so for the purposes of this video, it's probably worth asking. So marketers trying to do that would understand this, but you might be wondering, why is it a challenge in particular to market to software developers? And I'll start off by saying that it isn't per se, there's nothing, particularly unique about software developers as human beings. It's when you're trying to market to them in their role as software developers that things can get a little bit off the rails. And so if you're trying to sell something to a software developer that's like a tool to help the software developer with their job, that's where things can get weird. But, if it's just for something else, like if you're trying to get somebody to watch a sci-fi movie or, I don't know, buy a car, software developers just kind of fall into the segment of the general population. So what I'm talking about here is specifically marketing to software engineers about things related to software engineering. So why is this difficult and how do people get it wrong? Well, one of the first things that I see when I, read things by marketers who are talking about this is that they kind of like generalize software engineers almost as if it were a study in anthropology or even like the study of some kind of animal. So I'll read these things that say like software developers are really like skeptical, or software developers hate advertising, or so on and so forth. They're cynical, they're libertarians, whatever it is. The first issue here is stop overgeneralizing that persona. There are 20 million software developers in the world, and for the blog post, I actually kind of went out and Googled this. I found it interesting. There are more software developers in the world than there are Australians in the world. It is a huge population. So the way that I've seen marketers generalize software developers is really not helpful, because it's not, not only is it sort of like oddly stereotypical, but it's from a pure numbers perspective, ridiculous. It's such a large segment of the world's population that you can't begin to generalize them that way. So first of all, stop doing that. And if you do that in front of them, it's really going to cause them to tune you out, because people don't like being generalized that way. There's a lot of different aspects to a software developer's personality, a lot of different sizes and shapes of software developers. So first of all, stop with the generalization. Now I'm going to pivot on that and engage in a generalization, but this is a little bit different. It's to kind of categorize the software engineer's experience in the corporate world. And so here's the reason: if you're generalizing and saying that developers tend to be skeptical of marketing, there's something important to bear in mind when it comes to what the software engineer's experience is. And this really transcends the spectrum of software engineers. And that's the interaction with recruiters. So if you go into software and you get a degree, or you go through a boot camp, teach yourself, whatever you do, once you've hit the entry level and you start to get jobs, something happens, which is that you start to hear an awful lot from recruiters. There is more demand for software jobs in the world than there are software people to fill that demand. And so the recruiting industry in software is particularly mature, I guess I'll call it. It's a particularly developed industry. And those folks are constantly trying to get software engineers to leave their current job and to go to a new job. So they are aggressive and they are very salesy. And it is absolutely a dialing for dollars kind of industry. So if you're a software engineer and you have any work experience, your condition is inevitably to be exposed to lots of spammy messages about, hey, dude, bro, come work for us. We got ping pong tables. Like any software engineer, I ran a poll in Hit Subscribe Slack, and I forget the exact number of people that responded, but I asked the question, have you received a message from a recruiter in the last month that was completely ill-suited to your background? And 100% of people said yes. So that's what it is to be a software engineer. It's to be constantly bombarded with these very salesy, spammy messages trying to get you to take job interviews. And this might sound like a weird first world problem kind of thing if you're not a software engineer. Like, what's the problem with that? I don't think that, like, speaking for myself, having dealt with this for years, it's not that I mind people trying to find me jobs per se. It's that it has a terrible signal to noise ratio. So the overwhelming majority of these messages are not going to lead to anything, and they demonstrate an abject lack of interest in me or what I'm actually doing. It's just a pure spam play. So it's not so much that you mind what they're trying to do. It's that you mind the tendency to kind of lie, cheat, and steal and spam your way to getting it. Because the way that industry works is if a software recruiter places a software engineer at a job, say that software engineer gets a $100,000 a year salary, the recruitment firm typically gets about a $20,000 cut on that. So they have every incentive to just carpet bomb the world of software engineers with these messages and then kind of nudge them into positions, whether they make sense or not, and collect that money. So why am I mentioning all this to you? It's because the sort of natural way that software developers in their professional role encounter sales and marketing is just saturated by that dynamic, by people sort of trying to trick them and make money off of them, and generally be sort of disingenuous and try to use in lingo terminology in the software world in a way that just doesn't work. So they miss the message, and it's just kind of a mess. And so as somebody who's trying to write content for, produce content for software developers, if you're not technical yourself, you are kind of guilty until proven innocent of looking like a recruiter. And that, more than anything else, forget generalizing the software engineer persona and what they believe in and blah, blah, blah. It's really that the exposure is so much through this recruiter archetype that if you come off like that at all, it's kind of like the way that people get ad blindness on website copy. You just get used to not looking on the right side, the side gutter, or like banner ads at the top. You literally just don't see that stuff. It's kind of like that when marketing to software developers with that type of way of speaking to software developers. If you come off as sort of a marketing-y, I guess. So Hit Subscribe has done pretty well in filling a niche, which is that we enlist actual software engineers to talk to other software engineers. So we're creating content. It's one engineer saying, all right, here is how to get started with Ruby on Rails, saying that to another software engineer. That type of content is well accepted in the community. And it can be well accepted even if instead of just here's a language tutorial to get going, you're doing something like, hey, I'm writing an article for this company, and we think you ought to check out, this company's product. Even that tends to go over fairly well in the software engineering world, at least compared to a marketer trying to do that. So there's a lot to be said for the kind of cachet that's established when you actually know the technology and can speak intelligently about it. So that really goes a long way. Now, I'm looking here through the blog post a little bit, the guide for marketers or trying to market to software developers. One thing, if you are not familiar with software engineering, and I'll speak here a little bit to an audience, maybe if you're not as familiar with marketing either, one of the classic things you do in trying to market to someone or to a demographic is you establish like a target persona. So if you're writing content, you don't want to just kind of write with nobody in mind. You establish a persona, like Sally, the software engineer. She works at a company of this size, and she has, these characteristics. She has these pain points. And so if you're actually writing content and picturing Sally in your head, it's more conversational. It's good to be talking to somebody that way. Now, when marketers try to establish these personas, marketers are good at this. It's what they're trained to do. But there's a unique thing that happens in the software world, which is that the software engineering org chart is really weird and really insular and really opaque to outsiders. So one thing I would tell marketers, don't assume that you understand the software org chart. I promise you don't. At least not in any kind of detail that you think you do. So in the guide, my recommendation is go find software engineers in your organization that are willing to sit with you and have a chat. And ideally find one who has resume experience of a company that looks like the company you're trying to market to. And then sit with that engineer and figure out, like, what does that org chart look like? How do people interact with each other? And most importantly, if people are going to be buying, software from you, what is the software purchasing decision look like? Are you you have something that you're selling at a price point where the software engineer could just get out their credit card and buy it? Or is it something they're going to have to bring to their manager and get approval about? Or maybe is there like a buyer committee, it's called, where a whole bunch of people would get together and make recommendations, and then they'd be presented to the CIO because it's a $50,000 purchase they're going to be making. So a lot of that is very important to how you do marketing in general. But as a marketer, you really need somebody on your side to help you get that insight into the IT org chart, because you're just not going to have it. It's so nuanced and it's so complex. Another piece of advice that I offer in the post when it comes to marketing to people, to software engineers, is the way that you're segmenting the audience and dividing them up. You might think of like, how am I defining these personas? Is it like junior software developer versus senior, roles and responsibility, company size? The thing that I would suggest doing that will actually really get you one step ahead of your competition is get away from segmenting the software world by kind of aspects of their personality or of their job description, where they are in the org chart, their years of experience. Like, that's fine. It's not the wrong way to do things. But what you really want to be doing is segmenting on the basis of what they believe. So you're kind of looking for these like fault lines in the software industry. And there's a good example I could come up with, which is, let's say that you make a tool that enables unit testing. Now, in the software world, there is some fragmentation on the subject, unit testing and something called test-driven development. There are people who are passionately in favor of it, and then there are people who are really not in favor of it. They're tired of all the hype. They don't want to hear about it. I'm not going to tip my hand in this video as to which side of those I come down with. I do have a strong opinion on that subject, but it's neither here nor there. Find that fault line, and if you're selling a unit testing project or a product, the people who are anti-unit testing, they're not going to become your customers anyway. So it doesn't really matter if you sort of anger them or something. But if you write really pro-unit testing content, it's going to endear your potential customers to you. So I think it's much more helpful to do a psychographic segmentation, which means identify things that your audience believes and then kind of try to bind them to you. And that kind of persona creation, typically in most of the ways that we help our clients, is going to be a lot more beneficial in terms of figuring out the kind of content that you ought to be writing than just saying, well, this is aimed at senior software engineers, which, is more helpful than no segmentation, but it covers a pretty wide spectrum. So I think the industry just calls anybody with like 3 or 4 years of experience senior. So that's probably half of your 20 million people out there. You're still segmenting 10 million people. Much more helpful to segment them into psychographic groups of who would buy from you versus who probably wouldn't ever buy from you. And then when it comes to building a content plan, I make some recommendations in here, which is, when you've identified those psychographics, identify those fault lines, create blog topics on the basis of, let's appeal to the people who would become our buyers. And, if it risks making, enemies is strong, but if it risks, turning off the people who wouldn't be buyers, they weren't going to buy from you anyway. So those fault line posts are good, but you can take those psychographics and think about people who believe things that you want them to believe in the software world. What kind of educational questions are they asking? What are they going to the search engine and looking up or gathering information on as it pertains to your offering? Those are the organic search topics you want to come up with. So figure out what questions those people are asking the search engine and then just go answer those questions. So you want kind of a nice mix of ways to attract them. On the one hand, you're going to be sharing, probably written by you or someone at your organization, these thought leadership posts that bind your audience to you. The other side of that is the educational stuff. You can outsource that, write it yourself, whatever. The educational stuff to bring those people in through the search engine. Those are kind of the top of your marketing funnel. Once they have been exposed to you, they've seen your site, you're getting those first touches where they're becoming familiar with their brand. Then you want to have content that starts to speak to what I'll call pain, dream, fix. Pain, dream, fix means what you're really selling when you're selling anything, if you're doing a good job of it, is how are you going to make somebody else, how are you going to make their life better? So it's not you're selling your product and its features. You're selling instead like the outcome for the person buying it. So if they buy your handy dandy make the developer way more productive tool. What you're really selling to that developer is, hey, you'll be a lot more productive. You can get more stuff done. You can knock off early instead of staying at work till all hours. That's what you're selling. So when you start to think about that person who's kind of coming into your orbit and reading your content, you maybe want to get them to click on something where you start to speak to, hey, imagine what your life would be like if you were a little more productive and not staying at the office till all hours. That's kind of the dream part of pain, dream, fix. So you first help identify their pain. You identify with them and say, tired of the long slog at the office. The dream is, there is a world where that doesn't have to be true. And then the fix is go buy our product, go download our product, and this can be true. So when you're bringing in those educational reading people, or when you're bringing in the developers who kind of see the world the way you do, your next goal is to kind of get them to think about your offering as they visit the site and sort of envision themselves using it and having a better outcome. That's kind of the middle of the funnel content that you really need to have, that you're kind of nurturing their way towards. And then finally, what you want to do is identify champions, like who are the people that are really kind of believing this, and then you want to arm them in such a way that if they're making the case to buy this offering, like there aren't too many things that software developers and an organization can just unilaterally buy unless it's cheap enough that they can get out their own credit card and buy it personally. Usually they're going to have to get approval. So you want to, as they start to imagine their life being better with the product that you're trying to get them to buy, you also want to arm them with a way to go to management or whoever and say, I can make a good business case for this. Like if you buy me this productivity software, I can get features done in 3/4 of the time. I can get more features done. So you also want to lay out content like that they're eventually going to get to. Not to go too far into the weeds with it in a relatively short amount of time here in this venue, but often that content might be, instead of like blog posts, it might be ebooks, white papers, webinars, things that are a little bit more formalized or maybe a little bit more immersive. And then once you have all of this kind of content lined up that's designed to introduce them to your product, to build trust, and to help them, determine whether it would be a good purchase for them, the last thing that you want to make sure that you're doing kind of to parallel all that is to create a good promotion plan for it and to get the word out. You're not just going to write it, put it on your blog, and then hope that people come along. Like in 2020, developers don't really tend to follow brand blogs. Like they're not going to your developer tool site and saying, like, let me read every blog post this brand puts out. It's not what's happening. Software engineers are starting to get into media like Twitch, following Codecasts. But more commonly, if there's going to be following, it's more immersive experiences like they're going to listen to podcasts because that kind of audio connection is powerful. Maybe they're going to watch videos. So if you're trying to build a following, then that's going to be on those types of media channels, podcasts, YouTube videos. So then you start to think about like, well, how can I promote content in those channels? If it's written content, how can you get in front of them? Developers like Twitter demographically, maybe more than say Instagram. So figure out what medium your specific segment hangs out in to the best of your ability, and then produce it there. Developers go to a lot of community sites, read a lot of aggregators. So figure out how to get the content that you're promoting in front of them. But, above all, be authentic with it, to circle all the way back to the recruiters. If you are just promoting, trying to hard sell, it just won't work because they're so inundated in that. I mean, I dealt with this for years. It's saturated that it has to be educational and it has to be valuable for you to really command that attention. So make sure at every step of the way that you're like authentically trying to segment the audience in such a way where the people that you're trying to introduce to your product and convince to buy it, you're doing it by creating value, building trust, and you're honestly interested in determining who would be a fit for your offering and who wouldn't, and bringing the people who you could genuinely help into the fold. So that is kind of a summary take on this lengthy blog post I wrote about developer marketing. Hopefully that's of interest to at least some people. Hey, maybe you can take all this, and if you didn't have a specific business idea, now go market to software developers. I don't know. I'm probably kidding about that. I wouldn't do that. It's, not quite that easy. Anyway, hopefully this has been passingly interesting. And I'm not sure if I'm on the schedule for a little while yet, but at some point here in the coming weeks, I'll see you all again. So thank you for watching and catch you next time.